There is a photograph from March 2004 that most people have never seen, though it captures something essential about power, devotion, and the price women pay for both. It shows Nancy Reagan at Ronald Reagan's funeral, not the public funeral that drew presidents and kings, but the private moment afterward. She is alone in a hallway at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library, her hand pressed against the wall, steadying herself. The famous red suit is impeccable. Her hair, that helmet of controlled perfection, shows not a strand out of place, but her body tells a different story. She is 83 years old, weighs perhaps 90 pounds, and she is holding herself upright through what appears to be pure will. The photographer who captured this moment later said he felt like he was witnessing something he shouldn't see, not because it was scandalous, but because it was so nakedly human. Here was a woman who had spent half a century constructing an image of absolute control, caught in a moment when the architecture of that control was visibly crumbling. For the next decade, Nancy Reagan would live alone in Bel Air, in a house designed for two, with Secret Service agents outside and silence inside. She would outlive her husband by 12 years, years spent defending his legacy, managing her reputation, and discovering what remains when the performance finally ends. This is the story of Nancy Reagan, and it is not the story most people think they know. She was born Anne Frances Robbins in July 1921, in Queens, New York, to a story that was already broken before she could understand it. Her mother, Edith Luckett, was a traveling stage actress, the kind of woman for whom motherhood was an intermittent role between more important performances. Her father, Kenneth Robbins, was a car salesman who would leave when Nancy was an infant and remain effectively absent for the rest of her life. This is important. It explains nearly everything that follows. When Nancy was 2 years old, Edith made a choice that ambitious women of that era often made. She sent her daughter to live with relatives in Maryland while she pursued her career. For 6 years, the entire developmental span from toddlerhood to early childhood, Nancy lived with her aunt and uncle, seeing her mother only during brief visits between theatrical tours. Biographers often gloss over this period, treating it as a sad but unremarkable detail. But children remember abandonment at a cellular level. They learn that love is conditional, that presence cannot be relied upon, that the people who are supposed to stay will leave, and they develop strategies. Nancy's strategy was simple. She would become indispensable. She would be so good, so well behaved, so perfectly attuned to what others needed, that they would have no reason to leave. When Edith finally remarried in 1929 to Loyal Davis, a prominent Chicago neurosurgeon, she reclaimed her daughter. Nancy was 8 years old. Loyal Davis formally adopted her when she was 14, and she took his name with something like religious fervor. Nancy Davis. It sounded solid, respectable, nothing like the chaos of her early years. Loyal Davis was everything Kenneth Robbins was not: successful, stable, present. He was also rigid, conservative, and emotionally withholding in the way that successful men of that era often were. He expected excellence. He valued appearances. He believed that emotions were things to be managed, not expressed. Nancy learned this lesson well, too well perhaps. She attended Smith College, graduated in 1943, and followed her mother into acting, though without Edith's talent or passion for the craft. Nancy was competent on stage and screen, but never electrifying. She was performing something else, the role of a woman who belonged, who fit in, who could be trusted with the better parts, if not always the best ones. By her mid-20s, she had carved out a modest career in Hollywood, appearing in 11 films between 1949 and 1956. None were memorable, but Nancy was memorable, poised, well-connected, the kind of woman who showed up on time and never caused trouble, and she was searching. She would later admit, with unusual candor, that what she really wanted was to be married, not to act, not to have a career, to find the right man and build a life around him with the kind of totality that would make abandonment impossible. She met Ronald Reagan in 1949, and it was not love at first sight. Reagan was 38, recently divorced from Jane Wyman, and going through what we might now recognize as a midlife crisis. His film career was stalling. His politics were shifting. He was president of the Screen Actors Guild, drinking too much and filling the emptiness with ideology and long meandering monologues about communism. Nancy saw something in him that others didn't. Not the fading movie star, but the man who could be made into something more. She saw potential, a project, a purpose. Their courtship was careful. Reagan was cautious about remarriage. Nancy was patient in a way that suggested she understood patience was the price of admission. They married in March 1952 in a small ceremony that Reagan's own best man later described as businesslike. But what happened next was extraordinary, because Nancy Reagan committed herself to her husband's success with a completeness that bordered on self-erasure. She wasn't just a supportive wife, she became the infrastructure of his ambition. She managed his image, monitored his friendships, memorized his talking points, and created an environment where his only job was to be Ronald Reagan. When he transitioned from acting to politics, first as a corporate spokesman for General Electric, then as California's governor in 1967, Nancy evolved with him. She learned to dress the part, to speak in sound bites, to smile at exactly the right moments. She understood that a political wife is both prop and protector, and she excelled at both roles. But excellence came at a cost. The children, Patty and Ron from their marriage, plus Michael and Maureen from Reagan's first marriage, would later describe a mother who was emotionally absent, obsessed with their father to the exclusion of almost everything else. Patty Davis would write, with the cruelty of adult clarity, that her mother loved our father more than she loved us, and we always knew it. This wasn't entirely fair. Nancy loved her children in the way someone who was abandoned as a child learns to love, carefully, protectively, but with a fundamental withholding that guards against future loss. She couldn't afford to need them too much. She had learned that lesson at age 2. What she needed was Ronald Reagan, and in January 1981, she followed him into the White House. March 30th, 1981, 69 days into Reagan's presidency. The assassination attempt is well documented. John Hinckley Jr., a .22 caliber revolver, 6 shots fired outside the Washington Hilton. 1 bullet ricocheted off the presidential limousine and lodged an inch from Reagan's heart. But what gets discussed less often is what that moment did to Nancy Reagan. She was at the White House having lunch with a friend when Secret Service agents rushed in and told her there had been an incident. Not that her husband had been shot, they didn't know that yet. Just an incident. She was driven to George Washington University Hospital without clear information, arriving to find blood on the floor and doctors preparing emergency surgery. For 3 hours she didn't know if he would survive. Reagan, in typical fashion, handled it with Hollywood charm, joking with surgeons, quoting W.C. Fields. Nancy, standing in a side room in her red Adolfo suit, watching doctors work on her husband through a window, handled it the way she handled everything. She kept it inside and remained functional. But something fundamental broke in that hospital room. The rest of her time in the White House would be defined by it. She hired an astrologer. Joan Quigley, a San Francisco socialite, began advising Nancy on auspicious times for presidential travel, speeches and appearances. For years afterward, the president's schedule was partially dictated by zodiac charts, a fact that horrified Reagan's staff and later became a public embarrassment. Nancy didn't care. She had nearly lost the only person she couldn't afford to lose. If consulting the stars could prevent that, she would consult the stars. Rationality was a luxury for people who hadn't watched their husband's blood pool on a hospital floor. She also became more controlling, more protective, and in the eyes of the press and public, more difficult. She vetted every appointment, monitored every staffer, and developed a reputation for getting people fired if she perceived them as threats to Reagan's image or health. Chief of Staff Don Reagan would later describe her as the de facto president, and he didn't mean it as a compliment. The press, which had never been particularly kind to first ladies, turned vicious. Nancy was portrayed as Marie Antoinette, expensive, elitist, out of touch. When she spent $209,000 on new White House china, funded by private donations, not taxpayer money, the headlines screamed about excess while Americans faced recession. When she wore designer gowns, borrowed not bought, she was accused of being more interested in fashion than policy. None of it was quite fair, but fairness rarely factors into how the public judges women in power. Here is what makes Nancy Reagan difficult to reduce to caricature. She was simultaneously everything her critics said, and nothing like what they imagined. Yes, she cared about appearances, but she also used her position to launch the Just Say No anti-drug campaign. criticized as simplistic but genuinely motivated by her belief that she could help troubled children. She visited schools, rehabilitation centers, and drug treatment facilities with a sincerity that surprised even skeptical observers. Yes, she was protective of Reagan's image to the point of ruthlessness, but she was also the one who quietly pushed him toward more moderate positions, particularly on AIDS research and the Soviet Union. When Reagan met Mikhail Gorbachev, it was Nancy who encouraged the relationship, who saw Riza Gorbachev as someone she could work with, who understood that diplomacy sometimes happens in the margins of official meetings. And yes, she was thin-skinned about criticism, but she also possessed enough self-awareness to lampoon her own image. At the 1982 Gridiron Dinner, she appeared in a costume made of feathers and rags, singing Second-Hand Rose to mock her reputation for expensive taste. The performance was genuinely funny, genuinely self-deprecating, and genuinely strategic, a calculated attempt to diffuse criticism through humor. The question is, which Nancy was real? The answer, of course, is that they all were. She contained multitudes, but those multitudes were always in service of the same objective, protecting and elevating Ronald Reagan. But what did Nancy actually want beneath the performance? What happened to the girl from Queens who learned that love meant making yourself indispensable? Nobody asked, and she wouldn't have known how to answer if they had. November 1994, Ronald Reagan, 3 years out of office, writes a letter to the American people. My fellow Americans, I have recently been told that I am one of the millions of Americans who will be afflicted with Alzheimer's disease. At the moment I feel just fine. I now begin the journey that will lead me into the sunset of my life. It was vintage Reagan, graceful, optimistic, cinematic. It was also the beginning of Nancy's loneliest decade. Alzheimer's doesn't announce itself with a dramatic collapse. It arrives incrementally, stealing small pieces, a name here, a memory there, until the person you knew exists only in fragments. For Nancy, who had built her entire identity around being needed by Ronald Reagan, the disease presented a horrifying paradox. He needed her more than ever, but the person who needed her was gradually disappearing. At first, he could still play golf, still tell jokes, still recognize old friends. Nancy maintained the fiction that everything was manageable. They appeared together at public events. She deflected questions about his health with practiced ease. But by the late 1990s, the fiction became unsustainable. Reagan no longer recognized most visitors. He couldn't follow conversations. He needed round-the-clock care. Nancy cared for him with a devotion that surprised even people who knew them well. She spent hours sitting with him, playing his favorite music, showing him photographs from their life together. It didn't matter that he couldn't always remember who she was. She remembered. That was enough. She also became an unexpected advocate for stem cell research and Alzheimer's funding, positions that put her at odds with conservative allies who had lionized her husband. She didn't care about the political fallout. Ideology was an abstraction. Alzheimer's was concrete. Friends who visited during this period described a woman who was physically diminishing. She had always been thin, but now she was frail and emotionally exhausted, but she refused to complain publicly. That wasn't the performance. The performance was strength, dignity, and unwavering devotion. In June 2004, Ronald Reagan died at home, with Nancy holding his hand. He was 93. She was 83. The funeral was everything Ronald Reagan would have wanted. State ceremonies, eulogies from presidents, a procession through Washington, burial at sunset at the library that bore his name. Nancy stood through all of it in her black suit, accepting condolences with the practiced grace of someone who had been performing grief management for a decade. But after the cameras left, after the dignitaries departed, after the final tributes were filed away as history, she returned to the house in Bel Air alone, and she would remain alone for 12 more years. This is the part of the story that gets treated as a footnote, but it's actually the most revealing chapter, because in those final years, stripped of the role that had defined her for more than half a century, Nancy Reagan had to figure out who she was when she wasn't being Mrs. Ronald Reagan. The answer, it turned out, was the same person, only quieter. She devoted herself to protecting Reagan's legacy with the same intensity she had devoted to protecting the man himself. She vetted biographies, managed the Reagan Library, and carefully controlled how his presidency was remembered. When attempts were made to soften his record on AIDS or rewrite his stance on immigration, Nancy pushed back, not because she was political, but because she was protecting what was hers. She also began, tentatively, to rebuild relationships with her children. Patty Davis, with whom she'd had a profoundly difficult relationship for decades, became a regular visitor. They didn't resolve everything. Some wounds don't heal, but they achieve something like détente. Patty would later write that her mother, in those final years, seemed less defended, more willing to acknowledge pain. Ron Reagan Jr. also grew closer to his mother after his father's death. He described her as softer, but also lonelier than anyone should be. Because that was the reality. Nancy Reagan, who had spent her entire life making herself indispensable to someone else, discovered that nobody was indispensable to her. She had acquaintances, but few deep friendships. She had children, but relationships complicated by years of emotional distance. She had wealth, comfort, and security, but nobody to share them with in the way that mattered. She still dressed impeccably, still maintained the house as if Reagan might walk through the door at any moment, still kept his favorite chair exactly as he'd left it. In 2008, she broke her pelvis. In 2012, she broke several ribs. Her health declined steadily, but she refused to leave Bel Air, refused to live anywhere but the home she'd shared with him. By 2015, she was bedridden, suffering from congestive heart failure. Friends who visited described someone who was physically present but emotionally elsewhere, as if she were already gone. On March 6, 2016, at age 94, Nancy Reagan died of congestive heart failure. She was buried beside Ronald Reagan at the Presidential Library under the inscription she had chosen, "Together Again." So what remains? There are two children, Patty and Ron, who have complicated feelings about a mother who loved them, but always less than she loved their father. They speak about her with a mixture of affection and unresolved pain, which seems about right. Parenthood is rarely simple, and Nancy Reagan made no pretense of being someone she wasn't. There is the Reagan Library, which stands as a monument to a presidency and a partnership. Nancy's influence is visible in every detail: the carefully curated exhibits, the strategic framing of controversial policies, the overwhelming emphasis on optimism and legacy over nuance. There is the Just Say No campaign, which has been both credited with raising awareness about drug abuse and criticized for oversimplifying addiction. Like most of Nancy Reagan's public efforts, it was sincere in intent and complicated in execution. There are the policies she influenced from the margins: the quiet encouragement toward AIDS research, the push for diplomatic engagement with the Soviet Union, the moderating pressure on some of Reagan's more conservative impulses. History hasn't fully reckoned with her political influence, partly because she operated in ways that were designed not to leave fingerprints. And there are the photographs, thousands of them. Nancy gazing at Ronald Reagan with an intensity that borders on religious devotion. Nancy standing just behind him, one hand subtly on his arm, guiding without appearing to guide. Nancy alone at his funeral, her hand against the wall, holding herself upright. That last image might be the most honest summation of her entire life. A woman who learned early that survival meant making yourself indispensable to someone stronger, who found that person, who devoted every resource to his success, and who discovered too late perhaps that the price of that devotion was herself. Was it worth it? That's the wrong question, or at least a question Nancy Reagan would never have entertained. Worth implies choice, implies the possibility of alternatives. She made the choice she made at age 2, when she learned that love meant earning your place, and she spent the next 92 years living out the consequences. Nancy Reagan's story is often told as a romance, the devoted wife who stood by her man through assassination attempts and Alzheimer's, who protected his legacy and kept his memory alive. It's a comforting narrative. It fits neatly into our ideas about loyalty and partnership. But it's also a story about the bargains women make when they're taught that their value derives from their attachment to powerful men. It's about the cost of living through someone else, even when that someone else is worth living through. It's about the terrible loneliness that awaits when the person you've built your entire identity around disappears, and you're left with a house full of memories and no clear sense of who you were before him. Nancy Reagan was not a victim. She had agency, resources and opportunities that most women of her generation couldn't imagine. She made choices, some admirable, some questionable, all calculated to advance the project of Ronald Reagan. But she also paid a price. She raised children who felt second best. She endured a decade of watching the love of her life disappear in increments. She spent 12 years alone in a house built for two, maintaining a performance that no longer had an audience. The question isn't whether she was a good first lady or a bad mother, whether her devotion was inspiring or suffocating. The question is, what happens to a woman who makes herself indispensable to one person and expendable to everyone else? Nancy Reagan found out. She spent 94 years constructing an answer, and then she died in a bedroom in Bel Air, alone except for the staff, in a house that still smelled like his cologne. What she left behind. The inventory is smaller than you'd expect for someone who lived in the spotlight for 60 years. There is the grave at Simi Valley, with the inscription "Together Again" carved into the stone. Visitors still leave flowers, mostly older people who remember the Reagan years with a nostalgia that may or may not be earned. There are the letters, hundreds of them, archived at the library, revealing a woman who was smarter and more politically engaged than the public image suggested. Historians are still working through them, finding evidence of influence that was carefully hidden during her lifetime. There is the china, still used for state dinners, still controversial, still beautiful. There are the children who survived her and speak about her with the complicated honesty that comes from understanding that people can love you and still fail you in fundamental ways. And there is the example, ambiguous, troubling, impossible to reduce to a simple moral. Nancy Reagan showed us what absolute devotion looks like and what it costs. She showed us that you can get everything you say you want and still be fundamentally lonely. She showed us that the performance of strength and the reality of strength are not always the same thing. In the end, she was a girl from Queens who learned that love meant making yourself useful, who found someone to be useful to, who played that role with extraordinary commitment for more than half a century, and who discovered in the quiet of Bel Air, in the emptiness after the performance ended, that you can do everything right and still end up alone. It was an improbable life. The abandoned daughter who became a first lady, the Hollywood actress who helped end the Cold War, the woman dismissed as superficial, who turned out to be one of the more consequential political spouses in American history. But it was also a lonely life, especially at the end. And that loneliness wasn't an accident or a tragedy that befell her. It was the price, calculated and paid in full, of the bargain she made at age 2, and never quite renegotiated. Nancy Reagan died as she lived, impeccably dressed, carefully controlled, fundamentally alone except for the memory of the man she loved more than she loved herself. The performance was flawless. The cost was everything. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.